Lights fade in. The speaker steps forward, confident, calm. Sometimes life doesn't wait for perfect timing. It pushes you right into the middle of chaos and demands that you improvise. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was just trying to survive one evening, an event filled with people who judged her worth by the company she kept. So, when she turned to a stranger and whispered, "Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" It wasn't a move of weakness. It was courage wrapped in desperation. What she didn't know was that the stranger she'd chosen was no ordinary man. He wasn't a guest, he wasn't an employee. He was the CEO, the man whose name opened doors, signed paychecks, and decided futures. But here's the truth: power doesn't always recognize itself in a mirror, because in that moment, he didn't see a subordinate or a statistic. He saw someone fearless enough to ask for help, someone bold enough to risk humiliation for dignity. And that's where this story becomes more than a coincidence. It becomes a lesson. How often do we underestimate the power of a single choice? One question, one risk, one pretend moment that shifts our path forever. In her eyes, she was just trying to survive the night. In his eyes, she reminded him what real authenticity looked like. In a room built on status and illusion, she was the only one brave enough to admit she needed help, and that honesty became her strength. Over the next few hours, a simple charade turned into a revelation. He discovered a woman who refused to shrink herself to fit expectations. She discovered a man who was more than his title, and by the end of that night, neither of them were pretending anymore. This isn't just a love story. It's a power story about how vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, but the proof of it. About how sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to show your human side, because real leadership isn't found in the corner office. It's found in the courage to connect, to admit to trust. So tonight, remember this: the world doesn't reward perfection. It rewards authenticity. It rewards the ones who dare to raise their hand, even if their voice shakes. She thought she was asking for a favor, but in truth, she was inviting destiny to sit beside her, and the CEO. He thought he was playing along until he realized he'd just met the one person who reminded him why he started it all. In the end, pretending was never the point. Becoming real was. In every career, every dream, every human story, there comes a moment when everything feels uncertain. When you're standing in a crowded room, holding your breath, praying that someone, anyone, will say yes. That was her moment. She wasn't chasing love, she was chasing dignity. One night, one event, one chance to protect her pride. She turned to a stranger and said, quietly but firmly, "Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" A stranger. Polite, calm, mysterious. She didn't know his name, didn't recognize his face, and certainly didn't know that he was the CEO whose signature decided careers. He could have laughed, he could have said no, but he didn't. He looked at her, really looked at her, and said one word that would change both of their lives: yes. Now that's where the story begins, but here's what it's really about. The moment when humanity overrules hierarchy. When a title doesn't matter as much as a connection. Throughout that evening, two very different worlds collided: hers, built on survival and resilience; his, built on power and perception. Yet both found themselves stripped of pretense, because when you remove the roles and the titles, what's left is truth. He watched her navigate the room with courage that no position could teach. She watched him listen, not to reply, but to understand. And somewhere between laughter and silence, between pretense and truth, they both remembered what leadership really means. Leadership isn't found in status, it's found in empathy. It's the quiet choice to say yes, even when no one expects you to. We live in a world obsessed with control, with image, with results. But life doesn't always reward those who have it all figured out. It rewards the ones willing to take a chance, to say yes to the unknown. That one yes became a story of connection, of humanity, of two people who learned that pretending is sometimes the path to discovering something real. And maybe that's the point. You don't always plan your defining moments, sometimes they find you. So tonight, remember this: the next time life hands you the unexpected, don't shut the door too quickly. Don't hide behind your title. Don't underestimate the stranger in front of you, or the version of yourself that's waiting to rise. Because every great story begins the same way, with one question, one risk, and one unexpected yes. Every story begins with a single choice. Sometimes it's a bold leap. Sometimes it's a quiet whisper. And sometimes it's a question that changes everything. Can you pretend to be my date for tonight? She didn't plan to ask it. She didn't plan to meet him. She just needed a way to survive the night. A night filled with eyes that judged, whispers that cut, and expectations that weighed heavy on her shoulders. He was a stranger, sharp suit, calm gaze, the kind of man who seemed untouchable. She didn't know his name, only that he seemed like someone who wouldn't laugh at her desperation. What she didn't know was that he wasn't just another guest. He was the CEO, the man whose name carried weight, whose decisions shaped careers, whose power could silence entire rooms. But that night, power didn't matter, because for one moment, two people from different worlds met as equals, not through status, but through sincerity. He said yes, not because he had to, but because something in her voice reminded him of what he'd lost chasing success: authenticity. And in that yes, everything changed. Through the laughter, the glances, the shared silence, they found something neither had expected: truth. The truth that beneath every title, every facade, every carefully crafted image, we are all just people, longing to be seen. She had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, to prove she belonged. He had spent years hiding behind control, behind confidence, behind the armor of leadership. That night, both masks cracked, and for the first time, they saw each other clearly. It wasn't about love. Not yet. It was about recognition, the quiet realization that strength isn't the absence of vulnerability. It's the courage to stand in it, and that's the lesson she carried forward, and the one we often forget. In business, in relationships, in life, we chase success, approval, perfection. But what if the real power lies in honesty, in the courage to admit when we need help, when we're scared, when we're human? Because sometimes the smallest act, a question whispered to a stranger, becomes the spark that redefines your future. So when your moment comes, when life demands courage you didn't know you had, remember her story. Remember that the most powerful people are not those who never fall, but those who dare to ask, "Can you stand with me, even just for tonight?" Because that's how transformation begins, not in pretending, but in daring to be real. Every leader you admire, every CEO, every innovator, every visionary has a story that started in a moment of uncertainty. Not power, not control, but vulnerability. This story begins on an ordinary evening, a corporate gala filled with elegance, judgment, and invisible hierarchies. She was there, standing alone, a woman fighting to prove her worth in a world that often measured value by who you arrived with, not what you brought to the table. Then, in a quiet moment of desperation, she turned to a stranger and whispered, "Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" A simple question, a fragile request, a human plea, and what she didn't know was that the man she asked was the CEO. The man whose company's name was on every banner in that room. He could have refused. He could have laughed. But he didn't. He said yes, not because he was amused, but because he saw something in her courage. a reflection of every moment he, too, had once felt unseen. That night, something powerful happened. Two people from opposite ends of the hierarchy, connected not by status, but by sincerity. He saw her navigate conversations with authenticity, grace, and quiet strength. She didn't try to impress anyone. She simply showed up as herself, and that was enough. She, in turn, saw a side of leadership the world rarely notices, the humility behind power, the humanity behind the title. By the end of the evening, they weren't pretending anymore. They were learning that leadership isn't about standing above. It's about standing with. That night wasn't about romance. It was about revelation. He learned that empathy isn't weakness, it's influence. She learned that authenticity isn't risk, it's power. And both discovered that the smallest human connection can rewrite the rules of success. Because true leadership doesn't begin when you get the title. It begins when you remember your humanity. We live in a world that celebrates strength, control, and strategy, but the future belongs to those who lead with empathy, who listen, who see, who say yes when others turn away. So, the next time you find yourself in a position of power, remember the woman who asked for help, and the CEO who said yes. Because the legacy you leave won't be measured by your title, but by how you made people feel when they needed courage the most. In that one moment, pretending became something real, not a disguise, not a favor but a lesson. Greatness begins the moment you choose to be human. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. No warning, no spotlight, no time to prepare. Just a heartbeat, a choice, and the courage to ask. She wasn't supposed to be there that night, not like that. The event was grand, glittering, the kind where everyone seemed to belong. Everyone except her. She was out of place, out of options, and almost out of courage. Then she saw him, a stranger standing by the balcony, calm, collected, and unreachable. Something about his presence felt steady, safe, and in a rush of instinct, she turned to him and said the words that would change her life. "Can you pretend to be my date for tonight?" He looked at her, surprised, curious, and then smiled. "All right," he said, "just for tonight." What she didn't know was that this man, this stranger, wasn't just another guest. He was the CEO, the decision maker, the one who silently commanded the entire room. But for those few hours, none of that mattered. Because something powerful happens when two people decide to drop the mask. She wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying to dominate. They were simply human, talking, laughing, existing in a moment that felt strangely honest in a room built on pretense. And as the evening unfolded, something shifted. He saw her, not as an employee, not as a statistic, but as a person of strength and spirit. And she saw him, not as a symbol of power, but as a man capable of empathy. That night became a mirror, reflecting back everything they'd forgotten about themselves. She remembered that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about daring to speak, even when your voice trembles. And he remembered that leadership isn't about control, it's about connection. When dawn came, the charade ended, but something real had begun. Not just between two people, but within themselves. Because sometimes the story that starts as pretending ends as awakening. We all wear masks. We all walk into rooms where we feel unseen, unheard, unworthy. But the truth is, one act of bravery, one moment of honesty, can shift your entire path. That's what she learned that night. That's what he remembered. And that's what we all need to believe again. That humanity still matters. That vulnerability is strength. That asking for help is not weakness. It's the beginning of transformation. So if you ever find yourself on the edge of fear, wondering if you should take that step, say those words, or ask that question, remember her. Remember that courage sometimes sounds like a whisper. Can you pretend to be my date for tonight? Because in that whisper fate might just be answering,